My name's John Walker, and I'm the author of a book recently published by the University of Oklahoma Press, Bracketing the Enemy Forward Observers in World War II. And it's my privilege to be here speaking before you tonight. And before we begin, I'd like to thank Liz Nelson for inviting me. And as we go along, please feel free to ask any questions or even make any comments if you have any comments about anything that I say. Do we have any former forward observers or artillerymen here? Oh, I'm in trouble now. Okay, good. So you can keep me on a straight keel here. Let's see if I remember how to work that. Well, many things can make a very profound difference in your life. And reading this book 30 years ago in October added a whole new dimension to my life, either creating or bringing to surface an interest in genealogy and history that has led me in many different ways since then. And Liz asked me to, I think, talk not only about the book, but how I came to write the book. So I'm guessing probably most of you would rather hear about the content of the book, but I am going to start out with telling you how I got to write the book. Well, Footprints was published in Alliance, Ohio in 1919, and J.W. Gaskill wrote his book mainly from memory with the help of a diary that he kept in 1864 during the Civil War. And actually the diary is in the Western Reserve Historical Society if anybody is interested in seeing it. Gaskill served with Company B of the 104th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, a unit formed on paper in Alliance, Ohio, and mustered into service in Massillon in August of 1862. The 104th fought in the siege of Knoxville, the Battle of Orsica, the battles before Atlanta, and the bloody Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, among other battles. Now, Gaskill was a smart businessman, and to help his book sell, he included a brief paragraph about mentioning some aspect of every member of Company B's service. And then when his book was published, he sold the book to surviving members of Company B and their families. My grandfather Walker bought the copy that I have today that I read in 1984. But from reading the book, I found out, because he mentioned every member of the company, I found out that my great-grandfather, Hiram Walker, his older brother, William Walker, and their older cousin named for their father, Walter R. Walker, all joined and enlisted together and served in Company B. Well, this really intrigued me to think my dad's grandfather served in the Civil War. I never knew that. And this led to like a very deep interest in genealogy. And as a child, I read every book I could on like Guadalcanal Diary and 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and things like that. I was very interested in that. So I was interested in my dad's military service and was always eager to learn more. My mother would tell me things. He never talked about it with me. So as I learned more about my family history and discovered other ancestors who had been in the military, I kind of developed a parallel interest in military history to go along with family history. Now, as an employee of the University of Akron, I was entitled to fee remissions where I can take a class and pay the general service fee. So after I got interested in genealogy, I earned a Master of Arts in History. But before I graduated, my father had passed away. Well, I enjoyed all the reading of history that went into earning an MA. And so the idea of maybe going on for a PhD was kind of in the back of my head. But before you start a PhD, they tell you it's a good idea to have a dissertation topic in mind because a lot of students never finish simply because they can't come up with a topic. Well, I still had this interest in my dad's military service. But in 1995, I got in touch with my dad's former lieutenant, Jim McGee of Mount Vernon, Illinois. And this is Jim with another member of the same field artillery battalion in World War II. So Jim invited me to meet him at the 87th Division annual reunion that year, and I did that. And I quickly joined the association, became an associate member, and attended the reunion where I met my father's former lieutenant. And from that, I learned quite a bit on one weekend about my dad's combat experience. Well, Jim also got me in touch with the third member of their group, Mr. Gale Bricker of Star River, Pennsylvania. Now, Jim had written his own book about World War II, Golden Acorn Memories. The 87th Infantry Division's nickname is the Golden Acorn. So at this reunion, he gave me a copy of his book, and he put me in touch with Gale Bricker, who was the third member of their FO team. So, and that's Gale back in 1995. Gale of the three is the only one still surviving. I think he was still alive in February, turned 90 on Valentine's Day. Anyway, within a week after this reunion, Gale Bricker was son had married a girl in North Canton, so he combined a trip to visit his daughter with a trip to our home in Cuyahoga Falls. And then within a week of this reunion, I'm talking to the other guy who knew my dad in combat, and I'm learning all this stuff I never knew before. So all this just fed into my interest in World War II. Now, during the Second World War, the Department of the Army created a combat infantryman's badge to create esprit de corps among infantrymen, and that was a good idea. Infantrymen had seen combat. There were certain stipulations and rules to that, but the main thing was you had to be an infantryman. I served in Vietnam with the 1st Infantry Division, and no, I wasn't an infantryman. I was a finance clerk. There was all the glory, but anyway, when I was in Vietnam, somebody left a CIB, Combat Infantryman's badge, in my work area, and the guy had gone. I don't know who left it there, but I wrote my dad a letter and I asked him if he knew what a CIB was. Well, he sent me a letter and said, yeah, I remember what they were. I was given one by an infantry officer after we breached the Siegfried. I was awarded one after we breached the Siegfried line. But it was only an unofficial award because only infantrymen were entitled to it. But he was pleased to know that at least one infantryman realized that forward observers were in the war too. Well, I was still looking for a topic for a dissertation, and Jim McGee then began a campaign. He wanted to get the Army to develop or create a forward observer's badge similar to the combat infantryman's badge. So he was writing letters to congressmen, and I helped him. I wrote maybe 24 letters, and I got several replies, including one from General Westmoreland, who was actually my commander while I was in chief while I was in Vietnam. Westmoreland started his Army career as a field artillery officer, so I'm sure he did forward observation duty. But he said, well, he didn't think it was going to work, but he wished us well, so that was nice. Anyway, Jim's campaign failed, but from the responses I got, I came to realize that if you interviewed 20 people on the street, maybe 3 or 4 of them would know what a forward observer was and what they did. Most people just don't know unless they had some experience with it or came in contact with them in their own military service. So I began to think, well, that might be a good idea for a dissertation. A dissertation is supposed to, in history anyway, is supposed to shed new information on a previously unexamined topic. So before you do that, though, you better see if anybody else has already beat you to it. You better check that out. Publishers also prefer to publish something about a topic that nobody's looked at before, or at least a different take on a previous, something where you might disagree why something happened or how something happened. So anyway, there's one valuable resource for doing that, and I'm sure Liz knows about that, is worldcat.org. I love it. I love WorldCat. And you can go to your computer and look at this and search by title, subject, or author, and does it tell you everything that's published about something, or just almost everything that's been published about something, I think. So I looked on WorldCat and I looked many other places, couldn't find anything about forward observers. So finally, I wrote a letter to the U.S. Field Artillery Command historian and asked him that question. And he very kindly replied. He was very complimentary about forward observers in World War II, but I folded part of the letter where you can't see it. In the next paragraph, he advised me not to write about forward observers, but I didn't take his advice. Anyway, he was very complimentary about forward observers. Anyway, I think this letter from my father, and I think his letter and the experience with Jim McGee kind of convinced me, well, this would be a valid topic for a dissertation. And so in the process of writing the dissertation, I made trips to the National Archives. Actually, I made 2 trips. I made one after I graduated to get more information. Combined Arms Research Library, Carl, I can't say enough good about them. And the Field Artillery School, if you're not writing about field artillery, you probably wouldn't want to go there. And also the Army Heritage Center. But if you're writing if anybody has any aspirations to write something about Army history or military history, at least 3 of these 4 are very valuable places to check. And a lot of their material, some of their material at least, is online. So writing a dissertation, which eventually became a book, and I'll kind of talk about how that happened, I thought it would be advantageous to focus on both the Pacific and European theaters and say something about forward observers in both theaters. So I selected 2 infantry divisions to represent each one, and it was biased all the way. The 37th Infantry, that's their shoulder patch on the left, that's the Ohio National Guard. I focused on them in the Pacific, and the 87th, the Golden Acorn in Europe, and that's the unit my father trained with the National Guard, but he actually went to Europe with the 87th. And I thought I would have trouble convincing my advisors that these were representative divisions, because I thought they'd say, well, they did ask me, why'd you pick them? I said, oh, I thought they were very representative, but I really picked them because they were the ones my dad was affiliated with. Although I was not entirely optimistic, after I graduated with my PhD from Kent State, I submitted a draft of my book for publication to a publisher for consideration. If you do any kind of doctoral thing, your advisors always say, well, you should try to get it published. And so that thought was in my mind, but I was never really confident it would ever happen. Anyway, so I graduated, and maybe in late winter of 2010, I submitted a draft of my book for consideration to a publisher. The initial response I got was very favorable, and they kept getting back to me, we're interested. Well, 9 months later, they got back to me and said, we don't want to publish it. So that's the way it goes. The next publisher I contacted almost right away rejected it out of hand. They got the draft and they said the next day, no, we don't want to do it. The third publisher I contacted was the University of Oklahoma Press, and that was probably in late February 2011. And about a month later, I got a response from an editor, and he says, we're pretty interested in it. We'll get back to you. And they did, and make a long story short, almost a year later, they offered me a contract to publish it after many revisions and hoops I had to jump through and so forth. Anyway, great. I was elated that they're going to publish this. But even after that, there were more hoops to jump through, and it wasn't published till like 17 or 18 months after that. So if you have any thought about writing something for publication, just be aware after you submit it, it may take some time before it actually comes to fruition. So what began with talking to the 2 guys that knew my dad in 1995 finally came to a book and almost 18 years later. Now, as a World War II roundtable, I really have to figure you're probably more interested in hearing about the content of the book and like any arguments I would make or something like that. since the forward observation system used in World War II was something new, the first 2 chapters out of 11 include a short history of forward observation to explain why it was needed and how it worked. And this goes up through World War I. By World War I, field artillery had long range, great destructive power, and was extremely accurate. It was very deadly. However, the tactical organizations of field artillery units, and to some extent the technical capabilities of communications, precluded field artillery from providing close, spontaneous fire support to maneuvering infantry. So by the time of the American Civil War, they had field guns, cannons if you want to use that word, that could fire a projectile 2 miles or more, certainly in most cases out of sight of the cannoneers, but it took almost 80 years to develop a system where they could really use it in coordination with maneuvering infantry. So a couple of, that's the book. I should have clicked on that while I was talking about the book. Anyway, you know the books there. So a couple quick points. Firing field guns, a field gun, okay, 3 field guns, cannon. Cannon fires a projectile like use baseball terminology, a line drive. A howitzer fires a projectile like let's say a long fly ball, very long fly ball, 7 or 8 miles or more. A mortar fires a projectile like a pop-up, but again, that's a very long pop-up that could cover 2 miles. But you get the idea of how the projectile is covering the ground. Firing field guns at unseen targets is called indirect fire, but where firing field guns at where the cannoneers see the targets and aim at them is called direct fire. And the typical mode of artillery fire during the Civil War was direct fire. Now, of course, back in even medieval times, maybe somebody was within a walled fortress or something and they fired something over a wall that they couldn't see it. I mean, that's an instance of indirect fire. But the typical mode of artillery fire in combat was direct fire. The gunners, the cannoneers can see what the people or whoever they're aiming at, whatever, and they take aim at it and shoot at it. But the advent of long-range field guns, where the shell is going to go out of sight, began a long transition from direct fire to indirect fire. And even at the start of World War I, the armies of the world were reluctant to abandon direct fire. It was traditional, and the infantry felt safer if they knew the artillerymen were right there where they could see them. By 1917, U.S. field artillery doctrine called for the use of indirect observed artillery fire. Observed meaning somebody 4 of the guns in front of the guns up close to the target can see it and report the fall of shells, and then adjustments can be made accordingly. Reliable field telephones were in use during World War I, but quite frequently shell fire and so forth would break the lines and disrupt communications. So there were artillerymen in World War I called forward observers, and these guys were stationed in the foremost trenches, probably at an observation post, and reported the fall of shells on the enemy, what they could see by use of maybe hand signals or, I don't know, even rockets, anything, or maybe even field telephones, and they reported it to an artillery officer called a battery commander. And a battery, by the way, is like four guns, 4 howitzers. The battery commander is stationed between the forward observers and the guns, and he sees their signals, and he performs math on the spot, trigonometry, to calculate what adjustments have to be made. He relays that to the batteries, who then adjust the fire. It didn't work too well as combat progressed. It worked well when they're starting the attack, but as it progressed, it didn't work too well. When the infantrymen jumped off for an attack, the artillerymen were left behind. Soon, either the friendly forces were out of sight, now you can't fire because you might hit them, or they just can't see the target. So it didn't work very well. Most artillery fire used in World War I was pre-planned, but the battles that ensued rarely followed any kind of plan. In the interwar years, the Army convened several boards to discuss what they could improve and what they should abandon. One American artillery officer complained that there had been no way to provide spontaneous artillery support for infantry as riflemen advanced and encountered enemy strongholds. They're out of sight of the forward observers and the battery commander, so they can't do anything with it. As author James Rainey wrote, American infantry simply smothered German machine guns with American flesh. Alternatives to observed fire were rolling barrages. A rolling barrage is kind of ahead of the infantry as they move it ahead, like maybe 100, well, I don't know, maybe 250 yards ahead of them, and it keeps moving ahead, but when it gets up to the enemy lines, at some point they got to stop or they're going to hit their own guys. They don't really know how fast they're moving. That's a rolling barrage. Map firing is where they just simply look at the coordinates like a map and they say, okay, we're going to fire on this spot, and hit it. And they could do that, not a problem, but they just don't know what might be there at the time. And also gas shells, which were a pretty effective method of unobserved fire because the gas is going to permeate the area where it lands pretty well and saturate it. Many American units came under French command when they arrived in Europe, so they had to follow what the Europeans were doing. The Europeans had abandoned observed fire. So during the 1930s, the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill developed the forward observer system that was used in World War II, and even then it had to fight hard to gain its acceptance. Most artillery officers and non-commissioned officers with any rank or service wanted to keep the old battery commander system. They didn't want to see it go. And tradition in military, I think it's pretty hard to break sometimes. The Field Artillery School also developed the Fire Direction Center, the FDC, which performed the math calculations that the battery commander would have been doing on the spot. Now the FDC, and maybe somebody can help me here, is it like 4 or 5 guys? It's not just one guy, but it's like a couple of guys and they have different functions. But the Fire Direction Center is going to perform the math and calculate the adjustment to the guns to re-aim them to hit a target. Practical field radios were also developed in the interwar years, and they were used extensively, but they also found out that they weren't always, they'd go out at the most inconvenient times from time to time. U.S. Field Artillery also made the battalion the principal fire control unit rather than a single battery, and all of these things together enhanced field artillery's ability to mass fires on an enemy position. So when I'm talking about massing fires, if you think of a 4th of July fireworks display where they're shooting up some over a period of time, then at the end they shoot them all at the same time. That's kind of like mass fire. It all comes down on a target at the same time. So they did switch over to the forward observer system, and the forward observer took on many of the functions previously handled by the battery commander. The typical forward observer team on the ground consisted of 3 men, a commissioned officer trained to direct artillery fire, designated as the forward observer, and 2 enlisted men. It took 2 men to carry the field radio. It was that heavy, which was in halves, and then they each carried half of it, and then it was reassembled when it was ready to be used, needed to be used. One of the enlisted men served as the radio operator for the FO, and the other, besides helping carry the radio, helped the FO find targets and spot the fall shells. So in my book, I refer to anyone who did forward observation duty, whether they're a radio operator or the guy carrying the radio or whoever's out there with the forward observer. I call them all forward observers. And what happened was, after they got into combat, so many of the designated forward observers, the commissioned officers, would become killed or wounded or incapacitated that a lot of the enlisted men would, under certain circumstances, direct artillery fire, get some experience doing that. And then eventually when they became short on FOs, these enlisted men would be called to head up their own FO teams. That happened to my dad, and it happened to probably thousands of guys around, the Army and the world. Now, another important point that I make very early on in my book, and is that by World War II, the Army had decided to use light single-engine aircraft to direct artillery fire. And these were called L-planes. Actually, Taylorcraft Industries in Alliance, my hometown, made the L-2 during the war, but I think the L-4 proved to be the most maneuverable, or something, the one most widely used. But important point here, and I point this out in my book early on, the majority of artillery fire in World War II was directed by aerial observation. So what do you need forward observers on the ground for? Well, okay, any dissertation or even a historical book for that matter is supposed to make a point or make an argument, and my argument is that forward observers on the ground were indispensable because of factors like weather, which would ground planes at certain times, and terrain, which would make observation from the air pretty difficult to be effective. And it's just an argument. Of course, right or wrong, it's an argument. Of course, I know it's right, but no, I'm just kidding. There might be people in the room who would take exception to that, so that's good. That's fine. Now, let's really get down to World War II. Chapter 3 compares and contrasts German and Japanese artillery, doctrine, equipment, so forth. In fact, German and Japanese and American overall armies, German artillery and the German army as a whole were on a closer par with the Americans than the Japanese. Now, when I advised my dissertation, I got really criticized by one of the advisors because they thought I was denigrating the Japanese. But I think when you look at something objectively and people say this is the way, they point to facts, I think it's not a denigration, it's just an observation. Japanese soldiers were brave and tough. That I would never dispute that. But their artillery organization and even their infantry weapons were not as good. They had the bolt action rifle from 1905. We had the M1. Their howitzers, their field guns, didn't have the range and accuracy of ours. A lot of things, and it's in the book. Suicide attacks were a self-defeating tactic originating from their infantry doctrine, which said that every attack could succeed if only the attackers were spirited enough. I don't think that's true when you've got small arms and somebody else has whatever, you know what I'm saying. So it seems pretty obvious that if enough lives are lost over time, eventually there's not going to be anyone left to carry on the fight. But this was kind of a cultural thing in Japan. So again, I am not putting down Japanese culture or Japanese people in any way, but I'm just pointing out a difference in their thinking. On some of those islands, by the way, I'm sure some of you are aware, out of maybe 30 or 40,000 Japanese defenders, when it was all over, there was maybe 24 Japanese left alive, and those were probably ones that got sick and didn't know what was going on, got captured. The Japanese Navy was probably on much closer par to the American Navy, at least at the start of the war, but fortunately for the United States, their Navy, their Army and Navy were bitter rivals. They were very bitter rivals, and they contended with each other for vital resources like oil, and again, that's good for us. That was good for us. Well, getting back to the Ohio National Guard, it was federalized, half the Guard units in the United States were federalized in October 1940, and the Ohio National Guard was designated the 37th Infantry Division. 3 chapters of the book cover the 3 Pacific Island campaigns fought by the 37th, New Georgia, which took place in July, early August 1943, Bougainville, November 43 through March 1944, and the island of Luzon, the largest of the Philippine Republic islands, January until mid-August 1945. Battery C, 135th Field Artillery, trained in Alliance, Ohio. This was part of the 37th, and this was the particular unit my father, that's the unit my dad trained with, and I was able to get a lot of records from the National Archives, military records from the National Archives, and also able to focus on the actions of many Battery C members who did forward observation duty, including some of my father's friends. Unfortunately, most of these guys had already passed away by the time I tried to contact them. My father ultimately served with Battery 334th Field Artillery Battalion of the 87th Division, and also I was able to obtain a lot of information about the 87th Division and the 334th from the National Archives, and also from contacting many of the veterans over a period of years, and unfortunately most of my contacts are gone. So 3 chapters of the book cover the history of the 87th Division. Saar Valley, that's, I should have put a map up there, but I didn't. That's over by Metz, France, and west of Karlsruhe. The Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Rhineland Campaign, those 3 chapters. Excuse me, the Golden Acorn Division got into the war a little later than some. Don McCabe, who you saw with Jim McGee in the picture earlier, pulled the lanyard on the howitzer that fired the division's first shot of the war at 11 a.m. on December 6, 1944 in Metz, France. The shot was directed at Fort Joan d'Arc, then still in German hands. But the division saw its first real combat in the Saar Valley near Obergaalbach, France on December 13th, and the 912th Field Artillery Battalion provided artillery support for the 347th Infantry. Now the 912th's very first casualty was a forward observer wounded in the shoulder by a shell fragment, and the next day the 912th's first mortalities were a forward observer and his radio operator killed when an enemy artillery shell landed right in their foxhole. So forward observation duty was dangerous, and if either side realized that they were, through binoculars, they were looking at forward observers, they wanted to take them out because they knew what they could do. First of all, military records from World War II don't identify forward observers, except maybe in passing in a unit history or something like that. And what I found to be the best source for identifying forward observers was the general orders for a Bronze Star or Silver Star, an award, you know, because then it'll say this artilleryman, this whatever rank from this artillery unit was performing forward observation duty when this happened, you know. So I relied heavily on general orders for awards. And even at that, I don't know that you could calculate, like I wanted to be able to calculate a casualty rate, but I don't know how to do it. They go into combat. Their real combat is almost on the German border in France. And on the 16th of December, the 3rd Battalion of 345th Infantry is advancing to go over the German border. You're looking right at France, and the other side of the woods is in France, and this side of the woods is in Germany. And so L Company came through the woods, and they came out in the open. And when they got out in the open, they came under machine gun fire, German tank fire, and artillery fire. And the lead scouts were killed outright. Lieutenant McGee, was able to call a fire mission which took out the tanks and the machine gun fire. By the way, the little church steeple, it's like the green part towards the... McGee said that's been rebuilt because the church was in a heap of dust when they got through with it. But he said they thought there was a German forward observer watching them from the steeple. Anyway, McGee can knock out the tanks and the machine gun fire, but the 87th Division's position is on the boundary of 2 U.S. armies, and they think where the German artillery fire is coming from is like where friendly forces might be. So it takes 4 hours to get permission to fire on the German artillery. In the meantime, L Company is pretty well ripped up. And chapter 7 is basically about that particular battle. So inclement flying weather grounded planes during the initial stages of the Battle of the Bulge. I know the weather, if you've watched the movie Patton or the Battle of the Bulge, you see where the weather clears off after Patton calls for a prayer and all that. But I'm not making fun of it, I just think it's cute. Making use of forward observers on the ground even more critical. And again, the 2nd Infantry Division lost 32 forward observers within a 2-day period. The 1966 movie, The Battle of the Bulge, it's accurate in a lot of historical details, but it makes it appear like the whole thing was over before New Year's. And if you watch the last scene, the older gentleman who's fed up with the war throws his rifle away and walks back. That didn't happen. They fought every foot of the way back, and it took till basically the end of January to get them back to where they had been. Hitler didn't actually approve the order to retreat from Belgium until January 9th. Before Christmas, General George Patton had promised General Eisenhower he could have his 3rd Army in Belgium within a week. And shortly after that, the 87th Divisions pulled out of the line in the Saar Valley and transported open trucks in a very cold ride to Belgium. I guess they wouldn't put the canvas tops on because they thought they could spot German aircraft quicker if they, I don't know, but they were freezing. So by New Year's Eve, they're near Liebermont, Belgium. And in his book, Golden Acorn Memories, Jim McGee recalled how he and my father had driven a Jeep off the road to take a shortcut near the village of Vescoville. That's Vescoville over the crest there. And they wound up getting stuck in the snow. And so they got out of the Jeep and looked around to see what they could do, and they found out they were in a minefield. And it was an American minefield. Well, you know, we retreated after so this all got left behind. So they started shoveling snow out from under the front right wheel, and they discovered there was a mine about 10 inches under the wheel. But they got out all right. And it was in the latter stages of the Battle of the Bulge that a young corporal in the 34th Field Artillery volunteered to be McGee's radio operator. He had never performed forward observation duty. He didn't have to do it. He just volunteered to do it. Well, they went out, and when they went out, they came under German fire and got in some kind of a firefight, and the corporal was killed almost instantly in the battle. So forward observation was a dangerous assignment. Chapter 9 follows the division as it breaches the Siegfried Line and crosses the Rhine as the war ended. Anything that's deemed a historical first is always subject to revision, but the 87th Division history credits Jim McGee and my father as having captured the first German bunkers taken by the division in the Siegfried Line in February 1945. Those are bunkers in the west wall. I don't know if you can see the rectangles. And they're actually along a highway, the Schnee-Eifel Highway. On the evening of February 5th, 2 battalions of the 345th left the village of Kobscheid. I don't know if you can see it up in the top left corner, Kobscheid. And the 1st Battalion's objective is the crossroads at the top of the map, and the 3rd Battalion's is a little lower. So McGee and Walker and Bricker are the FO party for the F Company, and they're with them. And McGee said, well, it took all night to get to that crossroads, and by morning we were crawling in a ditch. And I thought, that sounds funny, but on the other hand, I think maybe that's the safest place to be, crawl in a ditch. Anyway, so they're crawling in a ditch, and they see this bunker, and they said, let's go get it. And so they approached it from opposite ends. I guess whoever was inside had no vision to I don't know. This is what he said. They approached it from the opposite ends, sprung out and startled the lone sentry, and then threatened the occupants of the bunker with a white phosphorus grenade if they didn't come out. They came out. Then later that day, they crossed a minefield with a German prisoner leading the way, had a gun in his back, and captured a 4th, much larger bunker. This is related in Chapter 9. Now, McGee had marked on a map like the one I showed in 1999 He marked where he thought the bunkers were that they had captured. Later that day, they captured a fourth bunker, and in May 2005, Alice and I made a trip to Germany, and a German friend very kindly drove us all around Mettelsheim and around the Schnee-Eifel area and walked us around. And he showed us this bunker, and this, I'll never know if it's the same one, but it was certainly in the same area on the map. That railing wasn't there, so actually that's the front. If you approach it from the front, you don't see anything coming. This is the back view. It's pretty big. And it's used as a hunting lodge now. So I'll never know if this is the same thing, but I was surprised there were any bunkers left intact, because I had read that after the war, this was a French occupied zone. The French went in and blew up all the bunkers. Well, maybe that was too big to blow up. I don't know. But this is a bunker, and my German friend thinks this would have been the first one they would have encountered on the way. So I'll never know, but it's interesting to me. Chapter 10 talks about forward observers. Now I'm talking about field artillery forward observers who were awarded the Medal of Honor two in World War II, one in Korea and one in Vietnam. Actually, a guy from Columbus was with the Cannon Company, was a forward observer, but he was an infantryman, was awarded them. So he wasn't in that. And there's another guy in Vietnam artilleryman awarded a Medal of Honor, but he was not an artilleryman, so I didn't include him. Anyway, it talks about what they did. All these guys were awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Very touching. Now, infantrymen could and do a good job of calling for and adjusting artillery fire. The most decorated American soldier in World War II also earned the Medal of Honor, and he lived to receive it in person, fortunately. And he both directed artillery fire and single-handedly halted a German attack. After his forward observer's radio failed to work, he told the rest of his company and the forward observer to fall back and take cover. And then Lieutenant Ottie Murphy used the infantry radio to call for artillery fire on advancing German infantry and tanks. Well, when they got too close to use artillery fire anymore, Ottie Murphy jumped on top of a burning tank destroyer and fired the mounted machine gun at the enemy and actually stopped the attack. And it's a burning tank destroyer, and he's wounded in the hip, and he jumps off, and just if you've seen the movie, just as he jumps off, it explodes. Well, his friends all ask him later, why did you stay on that thing for so long? And he says, well, my feet had been cold for a week, and it was the first chance I had to get them warm. You gotta love it. It's just Willie and Joe. The final chapter draws conclusions, chapter 11 draws conclusions about forward observers in World War II, and then it talks a little bit about how forward observation is handled today. This is a FO class at Fort Sill when I made a trip there in May 2006. Today enlisted men are trained to serve as forward observers. Things like GPS systems, lasers, and unmanned aircraft have made the job of finding targets and adjusting artillery fire much easier. But in retrospect, even with technical sophistication, without the technical sophistication available today, forward observers during World War II did a very remarkable job of adjusting fire. Now, that's basically all I have to say about the book, but since I've got an audience, I don't want to use the word captive audience, but I can use some help, and I'm gonna get off the track, just maybe a couple minutes here, not long. For several years now, I've been trying to learn where photos of my father were taken, in particular one where he's posing with Russian soldiers, which I'm going to show you in a minute. On April 30th, my dad received a direct or so-called battlefield commission to the rank of second lieutenant, and after the war in Europe ended, he was assigned duty as a motor transport officer. I don't know if that rings a bell with anybody. During World War II, the Germans brought many people from other countries in Europe to Germany to do farm work and factory work because so many young men were in the German armed forces. The workers were called guest workers, but they were really slave laborers. They were slave laborers. So after the war ended, all these displaced persons, or DPs, had to be returned to their countries of origin. And a lot of them didn't want to go back to Russian custody, the ones that were going back to Russian custody. But part of my father's duty as a motor transport officer was to transport DPs from the area of Plauen, Germany, to Russian custody. Again, this was, he didn't choose to do this, those were his orders. Well, he didn't write names or places on any of his photos, but he had told me once, and I wrote it down, unfortunately, that he had been in Marienburg, contacted Russians in Marienburg, Germany, which is pretty close to the Czech border. Alice and I were planning a trip to Germany in May 2005. Before we went, I contacted the city officials in Marienburg and sent them prints of the pictures, and they said, oh yeah, this one was taken in our town. So when we went there, we went to Marienburg, and if you look at the buildings on the right and the one immediately to the left that's on the left side of the street, and then look at the next picture, it's the same place. So I was standing on almost the same spot that other picture was taken. So then I showed them this picture. Now my dad is the one in the steel pot. I hope you recognize it, American helmet, second from left, posing with these guys like he's their high school classmates. I don't know why, but this is the one I want to know where it was taken. And the Marienburg people were, city officials, walked around town with us looking for something that looked like that. Spent 2 hours. We treated them to lunch, and then we said goodbye. But they said, no, we don't think it was taken here. I contacted the city archivist at Chemnitz, Germany. That's pretty close to Marienburg, and it's Akron's sister city. I don't know if you realize that. And the archivist there said, no, I don't think this picture was taken at Chemnitz. But this picture was in the group. She says, oh, that's St. Nikolai Church in Chemnitz. And the 87th Division history also mentions that the elements of the division contacted elements of the Russian army in Chemnitz. So if anybody has any ideas, if you have any thoughts or contacts or any ideas, you can contact me at that email address, and I'll be happy to hear whatever you have to say. And if you take the library out from the book and read it, and you have anything you want to say, good or bad, whatever, if you want to comment about the book or write to me, you can use that to get in touch with me. Do you have any questions or anything you want to talk about? Do I have any information about those German bunkers where cigarettes and magazines were uncovered about a year ago? Recently. And I presume this is on maybe Normandy or coast of France. I don't know. I've never heard of that. I'm sorry. I have not. Did I explore ebooks and iBook media for publishing? I did not. University of Oklahoma Press has the right to ebooks. If the thing's printed in ebook, they have the right to that. So a publisher, I guess they're going to assume that right if you don't. What kind of electronic? When I was doing my research, how much came from good old-fashioned paper versus
electronic sources? Did you rely heavily on electronic sources?
No, I did not. In fact, I used one or two websites trying to explain what grape shot and canister were, and that's about the extent of it. Okay. One point I would like to make, though, about publishing something of a historical work, I'll try to make this really quick, but historians distinguish between primary and secondary sources. A primary source is a first-hand account. A first-hand account is something like an eyewitness, a journal, a newspaper article. Government documents are primary sources, so military records are primary sources. A secondary source, my book is a secondary source. I was not an artilleryman. I wasn't there. I wrote about it. You could, if you were writing about artillery, you could maybe use something, make a point from it, but it wouldn't be a primary source. And that is important if you're writing a historical work, to rely heavily on primary sources. I don't think that's what you were asking me at all. I know that's not what you were asking me, but I just wanted to mention that. Did I go to Kent State? Did I contact Kent State or Akron U, University of Akron, or Kent State University Press? I don't know. I have not. Did I go to Kent State or Akron U, University of Akron, or Kent State University Press? I don't know. I have not. Did I go to Kent State or Akron U, University of Akron, or Kent State University Press? I don't know. I have not. Did I go to Kent State or Akron U, University of Akron, or Kent State University Press? I don't know. I have not. Did I go to Kent State or Akron U, University of Akron, or Kent State University Press? I don't know. I have not. Did I go to Kent State or Akron U, University of Akron, or Kent State University Press? I don't know. I have not. Did I go to Kent State or Akron U, University of Akron, or Kent State University Press? I don't know. I have not. Did I go to Kent State or Akron U, University of Akron, or Kent State University Press? I don't know. I have not. Did I go to Kent State or Akron U, I graduated from both of them. I did my, and I worked for Akron. I'm retired from Akron U. But I think I might have contacted Oklahoma because the field artillery schools in Oklahoma, that may be why they published it. I don't know. I don't think either Ken or Akron would have touched it. I don't know. I really don't know. As a result of this book, have I encountered any or come up with any questions of something that is still kind of like a intellectual curiosity or something I'd like to write about further? I don't think so. The one gentleman's comment about casualties, the life expectancy of a Ford Reserve, that's a good point. But if I could have, I would have tried to make some kind of statistical analysis of that, but I don't know how to do it. But after I turned 19, I was going to be drafted, so I enlisted. And I had friends who had gone in the service, and they said, well, if you enlist for school, you can have your choice if you qualify. Otherwise, you're going to take your chances. So I was working in a bank as a teller, and I thought, if I enlist for finance, might be a good fit. So I did it. That was January 31st, 1966, my first day in the Army. February 28th, 1967, I was in Vietnam, assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, Headquarters Base Camp Division Finance, at DIAN, it's pronounced Zion, Vietnam. I was there the entire year. They said before I got there they'd been mortared a few times. My friends who were there after I left said they got rocketed a few times. While I was there, we never got touched. Never got touched. I was very lucky. I'm proud of my service, but I was very lucky.
When did you arrive?
February 28th, 1967.
You were there during TET?
I was there during TET, yeah.
Surely something went on during TET.
Well, during TET, okay, I took home movies, and in 1998 I donated them to the Society of the First Division on condition that they give me a master on VHS, which they did, and I've had that converted to DVD. But after TET, actually this was about 10 days before I left, Don Oberdorfer wrote a book called TET, Don Oberdorfer, and it's confirmed in the back of the book in an appendix. Around the 18th of February, they had bottled up some VC or NVA who had been hiding in the Saigon area and ran them up past our camp. I've got home movies of, I don't know if they're Air Force or Navy jets coming in, dropping napalm or something, but you can't see anything out there. All you see is a big plane drop and a big cloud of smoke. And I've got a couple of those, and all these personnel and finance clerks are standing up like that, just their jaw dropping, people. We used to pull ambush patrol duty. We pulled perimeter guard and ambush patrol duty. And ambush patrol, it'd be like a squad or something. I don't know what it was, but 15, 20 guys, I don't know. With one guy with a grenade launcher and everybody with M14s. Well, we had M14s, we didn't have 16s, and an M60. And we'd go out, sit up overnight, and just kind of guard a spot outside the camp, come back the next day. Around the election time in September 1968, intelligence or somebody thought they spotted enemy activity outside our perimeter, so they wouldn't let us go out. They wouldn't let us go out. They were looking after us, I guess. I don't know. What was your impression? What was your father's impression of the Russian soldiers? Thank you. When he took these guys to Marienburg to release them to the Russians, the Russian commandant refused to take them because he said they didn't have enough food and water. But my father said the real reason was because they knew if they didn't guard them closely, they'd walk back to Plowin and try to get away because they didn't want to go to Russian custody.
Here is our traditional thank you gift
Oh, thank you.
from the World War
Thank
II
you.
Roundtable. And we thank you for enlightening all of us as to these importance of the forward observers, that how many of us knew very much about them. So thank you for that.
You're
and
welcome.
the other piece, the books about World War II keep coming out. The war has been sort of over for decades, but the books still keep coming out. So thank you for taking
You
us
are welcome.
behind the scenes of the publishing and how these books still are helping us to try to understand what went on back then.
You're welcome. Thank you.